Imagine a world where Lawrence of Arabia never became a legend, where the deserts of the Middle East never rose in revolt, and the Ottoman crescent still casts its shadow across Jerusalem, Mecca, and Baghdad. In this alternate reality, the Ottoman Empire triumphed in World War I, and the consequences were not just regional, they were global, shaping the modern world in profoundly darker ways. What would happen if the Arab world never fragmented into nation-states? If Zionism never found a home in Palestine? If oil wealth stayed in the hands of a decaying imperial regime rather than funding modern petrostates? Buckle up, because we're diving into a history that nearly did happen. When people think of the First World War, they often picture the trenches of France, the blood-soaked fields of Verdun, and the rise of American power. But in the East, a different war was being fought, a slower, more fragmented, but no less consequential struggle for control of the Middle East. In our real history, the Ottoman Empire crumbled under the combined pressures of internal decay and Allied intervention. The British and French carved up the region through the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. Out of the ruins emerged modern states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and most controversially, Israel. But in this alternate timeline, the Ottomans, bolstered by stronger alliances and more competent leadership, hold their ground. With better coordination with German forces and a neutralizing of Arab revolts, perhaps by a mix of brutal repression and strategic concessions, they not only prevent their collapse, but emerge from the war battered yet intact. The Central Powers, instead of being dismantled by Versailles, impose their own settlement. Europe is fractured, and the balance of power shifts, not just west to east, but from democracy to empire. Let's start with the most immediate consequence: the continuation of Ottoman rule across the Middle East. Without the British backing Arab nationalism, the Hashemite revolt fizzles out or never begins. Leaders like Sharif Hussein are executed or politically neutralized. The dream of Arab self-determination dies in the deserts of Hejaz. The Ottoman Empire, seeing the threat of ethnic uprisings, clamps down with an iron fist. The Armenian genocide becomes a model for suppressing dissent, not an international scandal. Kurdish, Assyrian, and Arab resistance is crushed with military efficiency and bureaucratic ruthlessness. No Arab nationalism means no Nasser in Egypt, no Baathists in Syria or Iraq, no pan-Arabism sweeping across the region. Instead, we see a bureaucratic imperial order that emphasizes Turkish supremacy, Islamic loyalty to the caliphate, and heavy censorship of dissent. Istanbul, not Cairo or Riyadh, remains the cultural and political heart of the Islamic world. This imperial continuity delays the modernization of the region in strange ways. The Ottomans, notoriously slow to industrialize, treat oil not as a transformative resource, but as a luxury export to fund their military and palace intrigues. Western companies, barred from direct access, find themselves negotiating with corrupt viziers and regional governors rather than forming client states like Saudi Arabia. As a result, oil exploration lags. Without Saudi Arabia or Iran becoming major oil powers in the mid-20th century, the global energy economy looks very different. America and Europe scramble for alternatives. Coal remains dominant longer, and offshore drilling in places like the North Sea or even the Arctic may begin decades earlier. Then there's Israel, or rather, the lack of it. The Balfour Declaration never happens. Without British control over Palestine, there is no mandate, no push for a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. Zionist ambitions remain a European issue. Some Jews migrate to Palestine independently, but the Ottoman authorities crack down on large-scale settlement. They see it as a destabilizing European intrusion, and in a post-war atmosphere of triumphal Ottoman nationalism, there is little tolerance for ethno-religious autonomy. Jewish communities remain dispersed across Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. Now consider the fate of the Arabian Peninsula. In our timeline, Ibn Saud, backed by British arms and money, forged the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But here, without British help, and with Ottoman garrisons maintaining control over Mecca and Medina, his rise is either thwarted or never begins. Wahhabism, the austere and militant strain of Islam promoted by the Saudis, remains a fringe movement, its influence neutered without state sponsorship. The Islamic world does not have its moral compass pulled toward Riyadh. Instead, the Ottoman Caliphate, increasingly authoritarian, positions itself as the one true leader of Sunni Islam. This consolidation of religious and political power creates a radically different Islamic identity. Islam remains centralized, conservative, and empire-aligned. There is no Islamic awakening as we saw in the mid-20th century, no Iranian revolution, no export of radical ideologies funded by petrodollars. Paradoxically, while the region is less revolutionary, it is more repressive. The Ottoman secret police monitor mosques, schools, and homes for signs of sedition. Minorities, Alawites, Christians, Druze, are heavily marginalized or forced into assimilation. Secularism is discouraged unless it aligns with imperial stability. The global Cold War also looks different. Without independent Middle Eastern states, the United States and the Soviet Union have limited influence in the region. No US-backed Shah in Iran, no Soviet-leaning Nasser. The entire region becomes a sort of imperial black hole, hostile to both superpowers and uninterested in choosing sides. Oil access is restricted, creating economic pressure on both blocs. The US might lean harder on Latin America or Africa for resources, potentially leading to even more aggressive interventions there. The Soviet Union, blocked from expansion into the Middle East, may collapse faster, or alternatively, turn its eyes more aggressively to Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Domestically, the Ottoman Empire becomes a model for other aging empires. Russia, assuming it didn't collapse into communism, looks at the Ottomans and sees a path to imperial reform. Colonial France and Britain, defeated in the war, suffer internal upheaval. France, without its mandate in Syria or Lebanon, turns more inward, potentially embracing authoritarian nationalism even earlier. Britain, no longer a Middle Eastern power, focuses on India longer, but also struggles to maintain its empire without the prestige of victory. The loss in WWI accelerates decolonization movements in Africa and Asia, but without a liberal international order to replace them, many of these new nations fall into autocracy or endless internal conflict. Meanwhile, the Ottomans begin to rot from within. Victory in WWI doesn't solve their fundamental problems, it delays their reckoning. Ethnic tensions remain, economic mismanagement grows. Attempts at reform are stifled by an entrenched bureaucracy loyal to the Sultan Caliph. By the 1950s, the empire faces wave after wave of insurgency, not just from Arabs, but from Turks themselves disillusioned by imperial stagnation. A coup in Istanbul becomes increasingly likely, possibly a military-led attempt to establish a more modern, nationalist regime, something like Ataturk's reforms, but decades later, and in a much darker context. The result is likely a bloody internal conflict. Think Syria's civil war, but across the entire empire. This has ripple effects for Europe too. The success of the Ottomans, paired with a German victory, creates a victor's axis that dominates the continent. France becomes a second-tier power, possibly descending into fascism or civil war. Italy may remain neutral or becomes a battleground of competing powers. Eastern Europe becomes a patchwork of puppet states. Poland never regains independence. Austria-Hungary survives in some mangled form, and Germany, having avoided Versailles humiliation, becomes a continental hegemon. Nazism may never rise, but that doesn't mean this world is free of darkness. The victorious German Empire is militaristic, hierarchical, and expansionist. It turns Eastern Europe into a colonial hinterland, suppresses Slavic nationalism, and engages in brutal ethnic engineering to ensure German dominance. The Ottomans, while technically partners in victory, are treated with condescension by their European allies. The Turks are seen as useful, but backwards, a convenient buffer between Europe and the unruly Islamic world. This breeds resentment in Istanbul and a drive for modernization, but always under the shadow of European superiority. As the 20th century progresses, the empire lurches toward internal reform while fighting off external manipulation and growing discontent. And then there's the cultural consequence, perhaps the most insidious of all. In a world where the Ottoman Empire never collapses, where Arab identity never finds its own political expression, entire languages, literatures, and identities are suppressed. Arabic is sidelined in favor of Turkish. Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, and Hebrew cultural centers are snuffed out. The rich tapestry of Middle Eastern history is rewritten through a singular imperial lens. The concept of self-rule, of national independence, is seen not as liberation, but as sedition. Generations grow up believing that identity is a threat and that empire is eternal. By the 21st century, the Middle East becomes the last great empire, a rusting leviathan surrounded by a fractured world. It holds Jerusalem with an iron grip. Pilgrimage to Mecca is tightly regulated, monitored, taxed. Oil production is controlled by imperial decree, limiting global supply. There is no OPEC, no petrodollar recycling into Western banks. Western economies are leaner, slower, more dependent on renewable energy out of necessity. Global warming may be slightly better, but only because oil remained locked under the sands of an empire that refused to modernize. And the people? They suffer in silence or revolt in desperation. Without democratic institutions, revolutions become explosions of violence. Without Israel, tensions between Jews and Muslims play out elsewhere, in Europe, in North America, in Russia. Without Saudi Arabia's influence, Islamic thought stagnates under the weight of state control. Progress, both technological and social, limps along in the Middle East, while the rest of the world reorients around new centers of power. So when we ask, what if the Ottoman Empire won World War I? We're really asking what the world would look like if the 20th century's grand experiment with nation-states, liberalism, and decolonization never fully took root in the Middle East. The answer is chilling. Victory doesn't always mean prosperity. Sometimes it just prolongs the decay.